do you think that there's a possibility, because people want to point the finger at China, and then you just tell us about the Opium Wars, and that is a big part of Chinese history, and you're saying that it was drugs from the West being pumped into China and destroying Chinese society. Now, the accusation is that China is flooding the United States with drugs and they're destroying American society, and that this maybe is intentional. And this is a theory that is thrown around a lot. I've heard Joe Rogan talk about it on that recent podcast with Tim Dillon. Is just saying, like, if you wanted to destroy society, your enemy, this is the way to do it. You can destabilize the United States without firing a single shot. You can use social media and then flood drugs into the country, and then boom, it's destroyed. Do you think there's some truth behind that it could be an intentional an act like, well, we don't want to have a nuclear war, but America's our enemy, and and this is the best way to destroy it?
You can't say that it's impossible. Now, it would be a casus belli if actually we had some real strong proof that that's what was going on. It would be, regarded as an attack really on the United States by China. And to my knowledge, we have not presented that proof. That suspicion exists, and I understand why it exists. It's not completely absurd. Again, there's a history behind this. I guess I would point out that in the case of the British, I don't think there was any intention to destroy Chinese society. It was just about making money. The problem was that the British were importing goods from China, in particular tea, and the Chinese just weren't interested in British goods at that time. And so they had this huge, trade deficit. And their solution was to grow opium in India and then sell it to the Chinese. And that way they could balance their accounts. I think it was just purely greed. And I think they clearly had to understand that this was having terrible consequences within China, but they just didn't care. So there's also the possibility in China that they're, again, I doubt that the government's involved in it. I think it would be too risky for them to do something like this. Again, the U.S. is always looking for excuses to bring hostile actions against China. And this would be, a real, like I said, a casus belli. I don't think that they would do it. But there certainly are people in China that just want to make money. What I understand is the number one killer is fentanyl now in the U.S. And the precursors to fentanyl are coming from China. So there are people that are making money. What
do we mean? Are precursors, is that just the ingredients to make fentanyl?
Right, exactly. Okay. There's, maybe not the raw ingredients, but just some like the first stage in the chemical process leads to fentanyl, some of the basic, chemical components. Again, that's my understanding of it, which is rather limited. And then, I think a lot of the actual, like the final process, the finished good is made in places, like Mexico, Central America, Colombia, and then smuggled across the border. I think in general that's how it's done. From my limited understanding of it.
Are they smuggled? Are they smuggled via speedboat from Venezuela over 1,300 miles on a speedboat?
Yeah, probably not. Right.
Well, what is the typical route? Is it through Mexico? And I mean, that's what I always thought it was. It's just through the drug cartels in Mexico.
For drugs in general, there are land routes, through Mexico, and then, but they're also we have a very, very long coastline, and there is drug smuggling that's certainly done, through the Caribbean, by smaller boats, speedboats. It does happen. There's no question about it. I don't think that particular boat was a drug smuggling boat. I've heard that the most recent, probably the most believable theory that I've heard is that it was actually, maybe you could call it human trafficking. It's just that this was, these were people that had contracted, let's say a certain number of Venezuelans who wanted to make it to the U.S., paid somebody to take them, to Florida or wherever, via speedboat. It was pointed out there's no reason to have 11 people aboard a speedboat if you're smoggling drugs. It just makes a bit of sense.
Well, one person.
Yeah, right. One or
more
two. That's
drugs.
I think that
Right.
standard is, it's actually, I think, like a DA official, somebody like that pointed that out. It just doesn't make sense. They know from experience there may be two guys on board. Why take up the space and weight with just a lot of human cargo? So I think this was, you could say, human cargo, and these poor people were just blown out of the water. But that's, that's a tangent.
Okay, well, so who should we blame here? I mean, is it a problem with like the American soul more, or should we be blaming China? Should we be blaming Mexican drug cartels? I mean, is it people in Venezuela, Colombia? I mean, like, how did we get here? Because it's like you said, if it's
Yeah,
a
well,
more uniquely American problem, then
right. Well, yeah, the blame is, has to be shared. The people who sell the drugs are not guilt free. The people who make them, back in China, they're not guilt. They know the consequences of these substances and they don't care. They just want to make money, but they're making money because there's a demand for it. Let's not forget that. There's a demand for it, a great demand for it, and that's what keeps this whole thing alive. And the demand is amongst Americans, and for people who just feel like their lives aren't full without drugs, or their life is maybe too painful without drugs. And that's a very sad state of affairs.
so how did we get here though? Why do so many people feel that way? And I mean, how do you solve that problem?
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, it's interesting. We've had a drug problem going back decades. And I'm reminded of actually under the Bush the Elder, the first George W.H. Bush. He launched a war actually against Panama, against Manuel Noriega, who was the dictator of Panama at that time. Accused him of drug smuggling. I think clearly he was involved in drug smuggling. But I remember that, and I remember being somewhat disgusted by it because it was just like, there's all this chest thumping and this righteousness. It's like these evil drug dealers. Okay, yeah, okay, grab the drug dealers. I agree with that, but there wasn't any focus. Any kind of introspection. It's just something Americans are not good at. Say, hey, well, why are these drug dealers here? Why are they making so much money? Because there's a huge demand. And back then it was cocaine, when you're talking about cocaine, a lot of times it's very wealthy people, people probably not too far from the bushes. They probably knew people that OD'd, they were looking for it and willing to pay top dollar for it, so there was this demand in U.S. society that goes back. Now the current, drug epidemic is somewhat different in nature. It's not like cocaine has disappeared. I'm sure, I know it's still out there. But this one is more focused on opioids, and fentanyl is just a super potent opioid is what it is. So prior to actually the appearance of fentanyl, which I think it made, it's been around for decades, but it didn't really um, make its presence known, let's say, until like 15 years ago, roughly, around 2010. But before then, we started to experience a very serious opioid epidemic, and it was, mainly what Oxycontin. That was what it. So that was really what that set the ground for the fentanyl, epidemic, which is it just turbocharged, a trend that was already there. I remember actually, like back in the early 2000s, again, the ground zero for so much of this. Again, for the opioid epidemic and the fentanyl epidemic is Appalachia. And of course, that's where we lived. We lived in a little town in Appalachia. I'll just give you an example. I remember, I had um, I had knee surgery, of some kind, and I was prescribed painkillers. And it was just like immediately somebody saw me with crutches and just like turned off the road and asked me if I had painkillers and how much would I sell them for. And I've heard that's actually pretty typical. I mean, these people go around, they look for crutches, they follow people to pharmacies and so forth. This was something I was only vaguely aware of. And that was sort of like the first thing, hey, there's something going on here. And now there were some real efforts, after this really got the oxycodone epidemic, which this was something that was in part actually driven by some the pharmaceutical companies. And this is part of the problem here, that they saw a way to make a lot of money, so they pushed hard, they and got doctors to prescribe this for just everything, when it clearly wasn't necessary. But every time a doctor prescribes this medicine, they would make money, and they ended up making billions and billions of dollars worth of money off of this. But then people became aware, this is an epidemic. People are dying, and so there was a crackdown. I just remember like later going to the pharmacy, and then well, the doctor wasn't so. I didn't ask for any pain killing medication, but like after surgery, that's something that you're offered. But then there were more, let's say, hoops that you had to jump through, and then the pharmacies had insisted on seeing your ID, and et cetera, et cetera. These were so that there were some checks put into place. There were some efforts, and then I heard like in their area there were certain like doctors that were known to just freely prescribe this medication, and people would just go pick it up. They're corrupt doctors. That was part of the problem. And I heard about I think there was one of them anyway got into trouble. Was arrested. That was up in '09 and not too far from where we
Oh,
lived.
really?
Yeah. So, this is something, again, that was all in the background, but it really became turbocharged after the introduction of fentanyl. Fentanyl is just like, it's something like 50 times or as potent as oxycodone. And you could just 2 milligrams of it can kill a person. Just a few grains of powder. Something that you can barely put on the tip of a pencil, that. So one of the problems with fentanyl is because it's so potent that it's very, very hard to calibrate the dosage. And, quite often people, maybe they were taking oxycodone before, and then they go into fentanyl and they just take too much, it's just, and die. The result is, respiratory arrest. So now we're talking about, I think just a couple of years ago, 70,000 deaths just from fentanyl alone. So yeah, I mean, there's a history, the pharmaceutical, but I think there's a larger social problem that you could see in places like Appalachia and where we live, and that's what the statistics show. There has been, they call them deaths of despair. These deaths of despair, include drug overdoses, um, deaths from alcoholism, suicides. Those are the main deaths of despair. And those deaths of despair have gone way up over the last 20 years or so, particularly, among poor, white, rural people, the kind of people, that lived in the county we lived in, up in the Cumberland Plateau.
Mm-hmm.
I remember reading about it, but I, I really, had the window, I really saw it or experienced it, not exactly firsthand, but I heard about it directly from somebody who experienced it, through our mutual friend, Chip, lived at the other end of town. Now, Chip himself had his own problems with opioid. He had a medical problem, and he was forced into a medical retirement, and he was prescribed, opioids upon his retirement. And then he gradually became addicted to them. And, he told me, I didn't, I knew him back then, but I wasn't all that close to him. And it was later we became very close friends. But he told me that it used to be that people were always showing up on his porch, asking him for pills, offering to trade pills, that kind of thing. It was just, there's this whole economy and, kind of a subculture of these opioid users, and they form a considerable portion of the population up there. And they were a plague. They were just always there, and they generally people, not the kind of people you wanted around your house. A lot of these people had sticky fingers, and so he suffered thefts and so on and so forth. But he had this addiction himself until he got actually arrested for driving under the influence. He had taken the pill the night before, he says, and then he got stopped, kind of a routine stop, again, in Oneida, not too far from Rugby. And then they did a blood test and found the oxycodone in his system, which had been prescribed legally. And then they cut off the prescription. And it was terrible, he said, but then it he said he really was grateful because it was like when all these terrible people kept, that used to keep on showing up at his house, when they learned that he didn't have the pills anymore, they stopped showing up. And, it didn't happen overnight, but over the course of a few months, they all figured out that, oh, he doesn't have pills. And then they just disappeared. They were no longer his so-called friends. But anyway, I mentioned Chip because it was through Chip that I met I remember spending like an hour with his friend, or not his friend, but his cousin Sheila, who just lived down the road. There's somebody who just was born and grew up in Appalachia. And she began telling me about all different people, including her own son, all the various members of her extended family that had died, from suicide or drug overdose over the previous several years. And it was a long list. And I was just shocked. It was one thing after another. That was it. These are those deaths of despair that have showed up in the statistics and really, have rang the alarm bells. It was something quite remarkable. And I mean, in the end, it actually, there so many of these deaths of despair were occurring, and again, particularly in rural America, that life expectancy among whites in the U.S. began to decline, which was unheard of, in the rest of the developed world. You see the steady trend towards, a greater life expectancy, but it was reversed in the U.S., and it was really due to these deaths of despair. So yeah, there's something going on there. There are people who just don't, aren't living meaningful lives. They don't know, I think it comes down, they don't have any sense of contributing to society. They're isolated, and they begin to, they experience this real emptiness, and they try to fill the emptiness with drugs or excessive alcohol.
So do you think that a big portion of the blame really lies with Big Pharma, that they created this societal problem? Because it's crazy how medicated America is. I mean, it's not just Oxycontin. It's like, antidepressants or
Xanax.
Adderall, Xanax, just like anything, you pop a pill. And I just, I remember in China, just like nobody was on medication. I had a roommate that was on Adderall, and he couldn't get it in China. And he was just like, this is I can't function without this. So he had to like find some special doctor in Hong Kong and fly down there. But he was just so dependent on it. And it's like, I can't function without this. And I have many friends. Everybody, we all know people that everybody's on 2 or 3 medications in the United States, but that's not how it is in other countries, especially not in China. It's just like, so did that sort of create, just a highly medicated society like this? It just makes it more acceptable to like, okay, well, yeah, we just, the Oxycontin was prescribed by a doctor. This is okay. It's safe. And then you have create this just a drug addiction problem. And then now we have can't find it, but I really want this. Fentanyl is available. It's cheap. It's on there. And so.
Yeah, well, no, there's no question that, Big Pharma has a big share in the blame. I think there's no question about it. I just gave the example of our mutual friend, Chip. It was not something that he sought. It was actually prescribed to him, without his request from the doctor, and then he became addicted to it. Now, fortunately, he got out of it, but you could see how that could lead into fentanyl and other things. And that's what's happened to so many other people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. Yeah, so they have, I think if you want to point a finger, I think you have to point your finger to many different causes, but one of the major causes, if not the major one, is Big Pharma. And, a huge lawsuit was brought against the
Sacklers.
The Sackler family. It was a multi-billion-dollar loss. I mean, they had to pay a penalty of billions of dollars, but they still profited. That tells
billions.
You.
They profited billions even after, so
right,
it was a very profitable venture for them.
right, exactly.
Why aren't they in jail? I mean, it's
Right.
clearly there was. I remember I heard about the stories about that, how they tricked the was it the FDA or whatever, CDC, all this stuff. It's these guys should be in jail. They
Right.
have, a million people, more people that died in World War II
Right.
that they are partially responsible for.
Right. No, no, I agree. I mean, it's um,
More Americans that died in World War II.
yeah, okay, yeah,
Yeah.
most certainly. Right. No, I don't disagree with you. There's, this obvious culpability, and it also just points to a larger problem. It's just that there's so much money to be made off of these drugs that the potential for corruption is huge. The incentive for corruption, because again, billions and billions of dollars ride on approval of one kind of drug or another. And the same thing goes for vaccines, right? It's this is a huge, huge industry, and so much money is sloshing around that you know the people that are supposed to be the impartial judges, the scientists and so forth, they get paid off, and or games are played, and so it's just when you have that much money behind something, you have ways of making things happen, and I that certainly happened in the case of OxyContin. It was just like there were a lot of there was a lot of shady dealings that went on, and so that it got the particular kind of approval and recommendations that it got. It was not a clean, objective process that led to that. Um, but I think we have to look at other things too. Like it, there's especially lower class, Americans. The working class has been devastated by loss of manufacturing. I think there's no question about it. And it's true for Appalachia as well. It's not like they were working class; they were poor, but they had jobs, and um, and so anyway, they were occupied, and they had a sense of caring for themselves through their own efforts. They had a certain dignity, but that has been stripped away from them. And I think part of that is the complete the disappearance of manufacturing jobs. In the case of like Appalachia, often there were kind of seasonal laborers. They would go into the city and come back, or maybe go to the city for a few years to make a certain amount of money and then buy a little bit of property, and have a farm and a small business in Appalachia, that kind of thing. But it was that those manufacturing jobs were their ticket to some kind of stability, economic stability, and those are largely gone. And then there's and they were replaced by disability, and other government forms of government welfare. So, it's like, okay, you have a lot of people, and, I knew about these people, some of
I
them,
know a lot of them,
yeah, right.
all on
You
food
know,
stamps and
yeah,
disability.
the
Everybody's on disability up in
right,
Appalachia
right.
and around Rugby area. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But the thing is, you can get that, you get your check and whatever, but you just have a lot of time on your hands, and you cannot feel good about yourself. You're not contributing anything to society. You're not even taking care of yourself. That. And I think you can see it. It's just like you can hear it in their voices when you talk to those people. They're not happy with themselves. And I think that, again, it just contributes to this sense of despair and, emptiness. Um, and then it's just like, let's say Appalachian whites, they're also a particularly, let's say, despised minority. Like if they're not allowed to have any sort of racial pride anyway. They're also told at the same time that they're part of the oppressor class, which is ridiculous. They're very poor. Actually, look at a lot of kind of social and economic measures. They're doing worse than blacks or Hispanics in general. When you just look at Appalachian whites, but they don't have that status. They're not told that they're told that somehow that they're actually responsible for other people's problems, that, and you can feel it. I haven't really followed popular culture very much, as in the last 10, 15 years at least. But I
Not missing
remember,
much.
but I remember, how it was. It was just like those kind of people were always the butt of jokes. Those kind of people were always, kind of displayed as the least desirable elements of society. And I think it has to seep through to them. Now, I
Mm.
remember even in like when I was in Berkeley, This was back in the 70s, but Berkeley was kind of always ahead of the curve on so many different things. But I remember a teacher's like telling us like she felt it was uncomfortable, like there was just too much of a guilt trip that just put on the white students. Like they were being told all the time they were responsible for the world's ills. And but those people, like those, myself and my classmates, most of us were headed for lucrative careers, prestigious careers, or whatever. It's like, we could handle that kind of thing, and we have found ways to deal with that. But if you're really at the bottom of the totem pole, you really are struggling economically, and you're at the lower social class, and you get that thrown on you. I don't know the extent to what it was done, in their schools, but at least I'm sure they got some of it through the popular culture. There's just this, the sense of worthlessness. I think it could very well engender it. So, I'm looking at different causes. I don't think it's a mistake to point to any one. Big Pharma, the disappearance of, the manufacturing jobs that used to be a real kind of, economic pillar. And then, this cultural aspect as well.
Right. Yeah, I know we're speaking from just our personal experience here in Appalachia, and the opioid crisis really ravaged the area. I don't think anybody disagrees with that, but it seems like now with fentanyl, it's pretty widespread. It's everywhere. You go to any cities. I mean, even here, after being in China for a while and then come back to Knoxville. I mean, I remember Knoxville when I was in college, and downtown, I never really saw homeless people, but I go downtown now, and there are a lot of homeless people, and you see these fentanyl zombies. They're just like this, just kind of it's creepy, it's scary, and it's just like, this is not healthy for a society. This clearly is something that needs to be resolved. Right. But the problem doesn't seem to be getting fixed at all. It just seems to be getting worse. And then what's even worse now is I feel like the United States is using all this anger and this despair that our society's feeling to use as a casus belli to maybe start a war with Venezuela. Like, right. Oh, well, okay, we're gonna do this. Like, well, wait, slow down. Let's fix how can we stop the problem here? We need to have people stop right. dying. Okay, we agree on border patrol, but what we got to go after Big Pharma? What we just need better education? We just need, like, what is it that we need? How do we stop that problem?
Right. Yeah, I think we have to fight it on many different fronts. Cultural, economic. Yeah, Big Pharma. Its role in all of this. I think those are all things that we need to do, and and then law enforcement too. That I think that has to be part of it. But yeah, going after Venezuela is absurd. Firstly, I'll go back to like George Bush Sr. Back in the 1980s. When he went after Manuel Noriega. Actually, Manuel Noriega really was a real drug dealer, and I think Panama was a real, hub, drug distribution hub. But I just remember thinking at that time that it was sort of a cheap way to wage the war on drugs. Okay, you can take out this one dealer, but in the end, it made no difference. The hub naturally just went somewhere else, and it continued because the demand continued within the U.S. That was a difficult war to wage, and that was the one that required some real, introspection. This other one was easy. You just send in the Marines and thump your chest, and you declare a victory in the war on drugs, but you haven't done anything. In the end, there wasn't even a blip. There wasn't any reduction in supply. Nothing changed. But at least in that case, you were going after a real drug dealer. Now, in the case of Venezuela, that's just not where the drugs are coming from. I'm sorry, that's what I think it was recently. It was like the UN official that was in charge of drug interdiction, or that the department that oversees that international drug problems, retired, but he was interviewed and said it was like everybody knew, like the two countries in Latin America where drugs didn't come from were actually Venezuela and Cuba. They come from Colombia, and I think especially from Ecuador these days.
Oh, that's what I heard as well.
Yeah. What?
Yeah, that's what I heard as well. Ecuador.
Yeah. Right. But Ecuador is, an ally of ours, so we're not going to bomb them.
Yeah,
we're just going to go after Venezuela.
Yeah, Ecuador's a little sketchy. They use the dollar there as well, which is it's strange. I feel like we're using Ecuador as our own kind of little agent in South America. Well, then it sounds like what you're saying then is the only way to solve this problem is we have to solve the demand problem. Because as long as there's the demand, like you said, means of production will shift somewhere else. People will find something, to some way to get it. Somebody's going to find it. There's over 1 billion people in China. You'll find somebody that's going to be willing to sell you the precursors somewhere and get you it. So,
Right.
but and then what you're saying is a lot of the, to reduce demand, kind of what I'm gathering is like, well, part of the problem is that we have this crisis. There's no manufacturing. There's not fulfilling jobs for the lower class people, for just everyday people in America. And so what do? So you've painted a real big problem that I don't know how we can resolve. Like, how do we
Yeah.
get people to have fulfilling lives here in America again?
Yeah, no, that's a hard thing. That takes real thought, and it's going to have to be a comprehensive effort. And it's you're going to have to be patient too.
It's
I
not
would
going to
say
happen.
too, it's just like, this is something else that I, saw. And, I am with the immigration restrictionists. It's always painted as something like a matter of xenophobia and whatever, but we have this phenomenon in the U.S. where, people come in, hardworking people, good people who want to make some money for their family and better their own futures and the future of their families. So I'm not suggesting anything else. But what happens is they're brought in, Mexicans and Guatemalans and whatever, to do these, to do jobs that locals used to do. Because, to be honest, they work harder and they'll work for less. So the employers like them. I understand that. If I was an employer and, trying to make a buck and trying to keep afloat, I'd probably be doing the same thing. But the problem is those people, that working class, the local working class, is now just sort of cast aside, and they end up on the disability checks. And then they even lose the ability. They don't even understand what working's about. Like, it just hasn't been in their family for generations, and then you're going to have a real problem. So we're talking about trying to rebuild. And part of it, I think, is saying, okay, we really have to stop just importing labor. We have to work with the people we have. And if they, even if they're, okay, yeah, I understand they're going to be a headache because a lot of these people have grown up with really bad work habits. But how can you, otherwise, what can we just say that we just give up on them entirely? We just can't do that. It's got to be a matter of incentives. Yeah, penalties. If you don't make a buck, you're not gonna have the fat disability check. You have to learn that, hey, you actually do have to work. That's part of it. I just remember, the reason I thought of that is that our neighbor, Edford, who was very much a hillbilly, somebody who, born and bred in Appalachia, and his family had been there for generations. The best job he ever had was as a coal miner. He told me that he really liked it. But yeah, he was complaining. He said that, and I was really kind of surprised, because they would have these, something that would happen like every 5 years is the electric company would clear the right of ways. The trees just grow like weeds around there. So you got to move in and cut down the trees. And it's a major operation. There's so much wood and so much land, that's constant. That's an ongoing thing in those counties there. And he was saying they used to hire local people, and now they just hire the Mexicans. And what they do is they mix, not people that live there, they just bring them in a van. And these guys, they work hard and whatever. I'm not saying anything against them, what they do. But this is just an example of how the people like our neighbor Edford just got cut out. It's just like, okay, yeah, maybe these guys had bad work habits, but you got to work with them and start to build up again and start, it's just like they're just kind of treated as, human rejects, human trash. We'll just throw them aside and then we'll find somebody else. And the problem is, like with those, often with like the Latinos that are brought in, the first generation does very well. They have very good work habits. But then often the second and third generation are just like the locals, and they become, they're on disability and the same thing. It's not a solution. You have to work with these people and start to build up their hands. You can't just, import people. That's the way, that the big capitalist thinks, I understand why, but we can't let that happen anymore.